first body arrived at Mercy General Hospital on a chilly October morning. Only 28 years old, Jenna Doe was brought in by friends, her chocolate skin covered in a sheen of sweat as she writhed in pain. Nurse Karen watched helplessly as doctors worked furiously to stabilize the young woman, running test after puzzling test to identify the cause behind her inexplicable symptoms. Nothing seemed to make clinical sense. No pre-existing conditions, and Jenna had been the picture of health just days ago. Yet now her lungs struggled for breath as a mysterious illness ravaged her body with frightening speed. In the chaos of the emergency room, Karen caught flashes of rising panic in the eyes of her colleagues, an unspoken fear that this was only the beginning of something more ominous. Over the next 48 hours, Mercy General was inundated by dozens more patients exhibiting similar complaints. Young and old, their conditions deteriorated rapidly despite aggressive treatment. Several died within hours of admission as doctors fought a losing battle against an invisible enemy. With each new casualty, the prevailing dread grew heavier in the hospital halls. Karen worked tirelessly alongside Dr. Marcus Schmidt, the hospital's respected head of infectious diseases, as they battled to understand this modern plague. Though exhausted, she found solace in Marcus's calm guidance, admiring his dedication and brilliance even as conventional wisdom failed them. During breaks, they shared conversations that revealed Marcus's passionate advocacy for population control measures, views Karen initially dismissed as radical. Little did she know then how his beliefs would shape the horrific events to come. 1 week into the crisis, over 300 patients had fallen ill across the city, with the death toll climbing daily. State and federal agencies were overwhelmed investigating the scope and origins of what was declared a high-consequence pathogen. Under Marcus's urging, hospitals came under military lockdown as the fatalities soared past 50%. It was during this period that Karen's doubts about Marcus first surfaced. While running tests on Jenna, who clung to life on a ventilator, Karen noticed peculiar scarring on the young woman's arm, 3 distinct puncture wounds that seemed out of place. Her medical records also listed 2 checkups with Marcus in the previous month for what were deemed unrelated issues. Karen brought her concerns to Marcus privately, questioning if the marks represented something more nefarious. But he dismissed her worries with practiced ease, attributing the scars to past recreational drug use and insisting she was overreacting due to stress. Still, a nagging unease turned in Karen's mind that refused to subside. She decided then to start her own covert investigation after hours. Sneaking into empty patient rooms under the cover of night, Karen scoured records for any connections between cases. What she uncovered sent a chill down her spine. Over 24 of the sickest individuals had all received routine injections or blood work from Marcus in the health screenings leading up to their deterioration. There were even references to a secret biomedical study he had been conducting with approval from higher powers. The pieces were falling into disturbing place. This was no natural disease, but a contagion unleashed through human agency. Before Karen could process the full ramifications, she heard shouts down the hall. Soldiers were sweeping the floors, hunting for anyone out of their quarters after curfew. She scrambled to hide the incriminating files, just as heavy boots thundered towards her position. When the soldiers flung open the door, Karen found herself staring down the barrel of an assault rifle. "You're coming with us, nurse. The doctor wants a word." Karen was dragged through the dimly lit corridors, her startled cries swallowed by the bones. She struggled against the soldier's tight grip, but his training rendered her feeble resistance meaningless. Moments later, she was thrown unceremoniously into a sparse conference room where Marcus stood waiting with an oily smile. "My dear Karen, what a mess you've gotten yourself into. Snooping around after hours, conspiring against your superiors. That simply won't do," he crooned in a patronizing tone. Karen stared back defiantly, mustering her courage. "Cut the act, Marcus. I know the truth now. You unleashed this plague, didn't you? All those experiments, the injection sites. How many more have to suffer for your twisted agenda? Marcus's mask slipped, revealing cold calculation beneath. You foolish girl, you could never grasp the scale of what's at stake here. Overpopulation is humanity's greatest threat, and sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. This outbreak is merely the first step to curb the scourge. There will be more. Karen felt her blood run cold at the admission of his depravity. Before she could respond, Marcus spun on his heel and addressed the soldiers. Deal with this one. No loose ends can be allowed. As they closed in, Karen knew this was likely the end. In a burst of adrenaline, she launched herself past the stunned men and bolted down the hallway, screaming for help. Her jacket flew off in the ensuing struggle, revealing the hidden hammer she had swiped from a supply closet. Wielding it desperately, she fought them off through sheer instinct, using every ounce of her strength and nursing skills to force an opening. Broken and bleeding, the soldiers let her flee rather than arouse the whole floor. Karen emerged into the parking garage, gulping frigid night air into her burning lungs. She had to get out, had to expose the truth before Marcus's insanity spiraled further. Scanning for her vehicle, only one thought pulsated in her mind: survive and reach her brother Adam, the journalist who could air the truth to the world. Headlights flooded her vision as a vehicle screeched to a halt. For a split second, she knew her pursuers. The passenger door flew open to reveal Jenna, pale but alive thanks to rounds of intensive killing. Get in! Quick! Before they notice you're gone! Still dazed, Karen obeyed without hesitation. As they sped from the quarantine zone, Jenna recounted her harrowing story. Against all odds, she had clawed back from the precipice of death, overhearing snippets between doctors that seeded her own seeds of doubt about the outbreak's origins. With Karen now a target, they had no choice but to take the flight together into the unknown terrors awaiting beyond the walls. In the ensuing days, Karen and Jenna evaded checkpoints by sticking to narrow back roads under cover of night. Whenever possible, they left coded messages on web forums and social media for Adam, detailing their discoveries and movements to ensure the truth lived on even if they fell. Exhaustion and frayed nerves wore them down as days blurred into a hellish routine of fearful hiding and logistical obstacles. During a brief rest at a rural farmhouse, Karen's call was finally answered. "You were right to contact me," Adam said gravely. "I've talked to outside sources and they confirm many troubling inconsistencies with the official narrative. But it's too dangerous for you both there. The military has broad domestic authorities now. Do whatever it takes to make it to the rendezvous point safely. Channel 7 promises to air your full expose on a national broadcast." Emboldened yet more wary than ever, Karen and Jenna redoubled their efforts evading patrols. They lived like ghosts on the fringes, scrounging for supplies amid a lawless population descending into madness under lockdown conditions. Yet fate had other cruel intentions in store. After weeks on the run, Karen's encrypted messages suddenly went dark without warning. Adam paced nervously at the deserted rest stop that was their agreed-upon meeting place. His contact was now hours overdue with no word of what went wrong. Just then, headlights shone through the misty rain as a nondescript sedan pulled up. His blood ran cold seeing who stepped ominously out into the glow. Dr. Marcus Schmidt, flanked by armed guards. "Such a shame. Your plucky nurse simply couldn't outrun her past mistakes. But you'll get a front-row seat to humanity's glorious future instead, Mr. Dawson. I think it's time the world hears my message." With Karen missing and at his mercy, Adam realized with dread that Marcus's toxic designs had only just begun. Karen, being the quick-thinking woman that she was, grabbed a pistol off a soldier's side and aimed directly at Marcus's head and squeezed the trigger before anyone had a chance to realize what was happening. Now, with Marcus dead on the floor, Karen realized that she would be in deep trouble with the government, but knew it was well worth it to keep this evil from spreading on humanity. Karen got her story to Channel 7, They aired the full expose. New government officials were eventually elected, and they enacted laws to assure this would never happen again. Dr. Victor Thornfield had always been a brilliant and ambitious neuroscientist. He was celebrated in his field for his pioneering work on the human mind, but his obsession with power and control had taken a sinister turn. The quiet town of Blackwood, nestled in the heart of a densely wooded forest, became the setting for his nightmarish experiments. Dr. Thornfield operated a private clinic for patients suffering from various mental illnesses. What the world didn't know was that the clinic served as a front for his insidious experiments in mind control. Under the guise of treating their ailments, he secretly administered mind-altering drugs, each concoction more potent than the last, to unsuspecting patients. As the drugs took hold, their minds became pliable and subservient to his will. One by one, he amassed a growing army of mind-controlled patients. They carried out his bidding without question, becoming his loyal soldiers in his quest for power and domination. The doctor's nefarious plan was to unleash his army upon the country and establish a totalitarian regime where he would rule as the supreme leader, controlling every facet of his subjects' lives. But as the doctor's power grew, so did the suffering of his victims. Families in Blackwood noticed the dramatic changes in their loved ones, the vacant stares and the unnatural obedience. Fear and desperation filled the town, but they were too afraid to confront the doctor, who had grown increasingly unstable. One patient, Sarah Turner, had been under the doctor's control for months. She had suffered from severe depression and anxiety, which had made her an easy target for Dr. Thornfield's experiments. However, there was a resilience in Sarah that the doctor hadn't anticipated. Her love for her family and the memories of who she used to be fueled her determination to break free from his control. Late one fateful night, while most of the town lay in a drugged slumber, Sarah managed to access the doctor's laboratory. She discovered evidence of his horrific experiments, detailed notes on the mind-altering drugs, and the master plan to take over the country. With trembling hands, she found a counteragent that could potentially reverse the effects of the mind-control drugs. Sarah began administering the counteragent to herself and others in secret. Slowly, patients who had been under the doctor's control began to regain their sense of self. Together, they formed a small resistance within the clinic, strategizing and biding their time. The doctor, growing increasingly paranoid, sensed a growing dissent within his ranks. He tightened his control over his mind-controlled subjects, subjecting them to even more sinister experiments. But Sarah and her group persevered, making small inroads in their quest to break free. The final confrontation came one stormy night when Sarah and her fellow resistance members stormed the doctor's laboratory. A fierce battle ensued, with the doctor's loyal subjects fighting to protect their captor. Amid the chaos, Sarah confronted Dr. Thornfield, who had become a shadow of his former self. His once brilliant mind was now warped and deranged. With sheer determination and the knowledge of the counteragent, Sarah broke the final vestiges of the doctor's control over her. She stood her ground, facing the mad doctor, who raged against her defiance. In a climactic struggle, Sarah managed to inject Dr. Thornfield with the counteragent, freeing his mind from the grip of his own creation. The doctor, now free from the effects of his own mind-control drugs, was overcome with remorse for the atrocities he had committed. He begged for forgiveness, but knew that he would have to pay for his crimes. The town of Blackwood was finally freed from the doctor's reign of terror, and the patients who had been controlled were rehabilitated as best as possible. Dr. Victor Thornfield was arrested, tried, and sentenced to a lifetime in a mental institution, a prisoner of the very mind he had sought to control. Sarah, forever scarred by her ordeal, became a symbol of resilience and hope for the town of Blackwood. The horrors that had transpired in the clinic would never be forgotten, a chilling reminder of the darkness that could lurk within the human mind. Dr. Nathaniel Harkness was a renowned physician whose fame had spread to every corner of the world. His practice was located in a sprawling, opulent medical facility nestled deep within the heart of a picturesque countryside. Patients from all walks of life flocked to him, desperate for a cure to their myriad ailments. Little did they know that behind Dr. Harkness's polished veneer lay a malevolent scheme, one that would make him the richest and most sinister doctor in history. Dr. Harkness was a man of impressive intelligence and charisma, with a sharp mind that allowed him to diagnose and treat even the most complex medical conditions. His silver hair and piercing blue eyes made him look every bit the part of a distinguished physician. Patients trusted him implicitly, and they had no reason to doubt his intentions. However, Dr. Harkness had a dark secret. He had devised a diabolical plan to amass unimaginable wealth at the expense of his trusting patients. His method was deceptively simple, yet incredibly effective. He would prescribe treatments that seemed to alleviate the patient's conditions initially, but in reality, they were designed to cause more severe and recurring illnesses, necessitating additional treatments. One of his first victims was Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a frail woman suffering from a persistent cough. Dr. Harkness diagnosed her with a mild respiratory infection and prescribed a series of medications that seemed to provide temporary relief. However, unbeknownst to Mrs. Thornton, the medicines were laced with an insidious compound that would slowly deteriorate her respiratory system. Her condition worsened, and she returned to Dr. Harkness for more treatment, each visit depleting her savings. Dr. Harkness employed a cadre of highly skilled and equally unscrupulous nurses and pharmacists who executed his nefarious plans with precision. They made sure that his patients never suspected foul play. Over time, the doctor's reputation for miraculously treating patients with recurring and severe conditions only grew, and so did his bank account. As news of Dr. Harkness's miraculous treatment spread, patients came from all over the world. No one suspected the truth behind the doctor's success. His facility expanded into a sprawling, fortress-like complex that rivaled the most luxurious hospitals in the world. Patients, desperate for hope and a cure, would leave their life savings behind, never realizing that they were merely contributing to Dr. Harkness's ever-expanding wealth. One of the most sinister aspects of Dr. Harkness's plan was his involvement in pharmaceutical research. He directed his team to create cutting-edge treatments for various ailments, always with a hidden catch. The drugs had hidden side effects that would manifest over time, driving patients back into the doctor's clutches for more treatments. Over the years, Dr. Harkness amassed a fortune beyond imagination. His estate was a sprawling mansion filled with priceless art and extravagant trinkets. He traveled the world in private jets and sailed on yachts, all while his patients continued to suffer under the guise of medical treatment. But as with all nefarious plots, there came a day when Dr. Harkness's deeds would catch up with him. A former nurse, guilt-ridden by her part in his scheme, could no longer bear the weight of her conscience. She gathered evidence of his malevolent actions and presented it to a fearless investigative journalist, Sarah Mitchell. Sarah was determined to expose Dr. Harkness for the monster he truly was. She infiltrated his practice, interviewed former patients, and collected a mountain of evidence. The story she uncovered was beyond belief, a horrifying tale of greed and deception. Sarah's exposé rocked the world, and the medical community was left in shock. Dr. Harkness's empire crumbled, and he found himself standing before a courtroom, facing countless charges of malpractice, fraud, and endangering lives. The trial was a media sensation, and his patients, now realizing the truth behind their suffering, watched with a mixture of anger and despair. Dr. Harkness was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. His vast fortune was seized and redistributed to his victims, providing some measure of solace. Dr. Nathaniel Harkness, once the richest and most celebrated doctor in the world, was now infamous as the most sinister. His legacy served as a chilling reminder of the darkness that could hide behind a facade of trust and benevolence, and the horrors that could befall those who placed their lives in the wrong hands. Dr. Jonathan Monroe was a respected physician in the small town of Crestwood. His calm demeanor and impeccable bedside manner earned him the trust and admiration of his patients. Little did they know that behind the comforting facade of a dedicated healer, he concealed a dark and sinister secret. Dr. Monroe had always been fascinated by death. He spent his nights studying the intricacies of human anatomy and the effects of various medications on the human body. His obsession with mortality and the afterlife grew to such an extent that he became convinced he could gain unparalleled power by sending souls to the other side. He decided that he alone would determine who lived and who died. Crestwood was a close-knit community, and Dr. Monroe's reputation made him the go-to physician for most of its residents. His medical practice became a perfect cover for his murderous ambitions. He began selecting his victims carefully, choosing those with chronic illnesses or elderly patients who wouldn't raise suspicions if they suddenly passed away. Their deaths would be attributed to their pre-existing conditions, and the doctor would remain above suspicion. Dr. Monroe's method of choice was to poison his patients slowly. He would prescribe medications that appeared harmless, but when combined, became lethal. He tampered with their medical records to make their deteriorating conditions seem like natural progressions of their illnesses. As more and more of his patients died under his care, he reveled in the power he believed he held over life and death. Detective Laura Mitchell had always been suspicious of Dr. Monroe. As a newcomer to Crestwood, she couldn't ignore the high mortality rate among his patients, especially those who had been previously stable. Determined to expose the truth, she began her own investigation. She dug deep into medical records, interviewed families of the deceased, and consulted with other medical experts. With each passing day, the evidence against Dr. Monroe grew stronger. Suspicion began to mount in Crestwood as the detective's persistence bore fruit. One by one, the families of the victims began to piece together the puzzle of their loved ones' untimely deaths. Dr. Monroe, aware that he was being scrutinized, became increasingly paranoid. He started to make mistakes in covering his tracks, leaving behind traces of the poison he used. Detective Mitchell seized this opportunity and obtained a search warrant for the doctor's clinic. The day of reckoning arrived as the detective, accompanied by a team of investigators, raided Dr. Monroe's clinic. They found a hidden stash of deadly medications and undeniable proof of his malevolent actions. As the truth came to light, the town of Crestwood was left in shock and disbelief. Dr. Monroe was arrested and brought to trial, where he faced charges of multiple counts of murder and medical malpractice. The townspeople were horrified to learn that the trusted doctor they had turned to for years had been a cold-blooded serial killer. As the court proceedings unfolded, Dr. Monroe showed no remorse, further deepening the horror of his crimes. In the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once respected doctor was now an infamous serial killer, forever shrouded in the darkness of his twisted obsession with life and death. Crestwood, scarred by the horrifying revelation, vowed never to forget the chilling tale of Dr. Jonathan Monroe, the doctor who used medicine to commit heinous murders while hiding in plain sight.